Welcome back then folks to the second build, or the sixth build overall, but the second build of day 3 of Special Projects Pack number 12. This time you will remember the car. If you used to play Gran Turismo in the older games from especially, I guess, 4 through 6, you might not have used the car that much, because especially back in the days of GT4, the physics didn't exactly lend themselves, ironically, to cars like this. Despite the fact that Polyphony seemed to have quite the obsession with putting drift cars in the game, even though GT4 wasn't really that great for drifting. You could do it, but it's come a long way since then. You'd have, the Blitz Skylines, you had this one, the BP Falcon, you had the Hyper Sylvia, a couple of others which I'm probably forgetting as well. This one was always one of the ones which was striking to me visually, because as far as the FC Generation RX-7 goes, there wasn't really too much in the way of motorsport or pre-tuned versions, which always surprises me, because it's such an iconic shape of car, and there are some aftermarket ones to go for, so it seemed weird to me that Gran Turismo kind of overlooked them for the most part. So in the original 2 games, I think there were some versions, like, the A-Spec or something like that, but aside from that, not too many. This one, for those who maybe are not as much of a fan of drifting, I think you might want to give it a go, because it might be easier to drift with than you'd think. And if you're not that great of a drifter, it could be a good place to start, at least to get into it. So, as far as the build, of course, this is going to be very different in certain ways to what I would typically do. I don't do too many drift builds, and to be honest, I don't do too much drifting myself. But when I do enjoy it. It's just that Gran Turismo doesn't necessarily have my favourite physics for drifting. If I'm going to do it, I prefer, very arcade-ish, super over-the-top physics. So stuff like Forza, for example. But in terms of this particular car, we've got Comfort Hards and Sport Hards fitted, and I've also got the Comfort Softs as well. Now, we'll double check in a second, because one of those, of course, you have as standard. I think it might be the Softs, the Comfort Softs that come as standard, but I've got different tyres on the front and the rear. So again, immediately different to most of the other builds that I do. Stage 1 weight as well. For the Club Sport stuff, we've got the Stage 2 weight, the power restrictor. I'll just double check on no, there isn't a stage 5 weight, I wanted to be sure. The power restrictor, the ballast as well. As far as the semi-racing stuff, I've opted for the low RPM turbo, because for those wondering, I am using Gran Turismo 6 as the reference, so pretty close on horsepower, pretty close on weight, about as close as you can get really. 412 horses, I don't recall if that's exact or not, and 1229 kilos, which is spot on. As far as the points, pretty modest as well, 545. The tyres are obviously a big reason for that though. The low RPM turbo is pretty obvious why. For those who don't know, it means that it spools up quicker. There's less lag on the turbo, so you can keep it spooled up more. I know some drifters like to go for mid-range, because that tends to be the kind of rev range you're in, but it depends. It's all down to personal preference, and it does hamstring you a bit when you're trying to replicate a specific amount of horsepower rather than just building it in whatever way you want. So you could change that if you want to and swap around some other things. I'll leave that down to you, and that's for the more seasoned drifters anyway to decide. We've got the fully customised computer, the limited slip diff, of course. It's a joke to build a drift car without that. The fully customised manual box. The stage 3 weight I actually haven't done though. Quite surprising, because you don't actually need it. And that takes the car too far in terms of getting the weight. I guess you could do that if you want to put the ballast even further to give it a real back-end bias for drifting, but I'd try this out first because I'd say it's already pretty damn good for drifting if I don't say so myself. As far as the racing stuff, we've got the silencer, the filter, the intercooler, the exhaust, the pads, and the discs. Like I've always said, it doesn't really matter if you go for drilled, slotted, you could even go for ceramics. It's not entirely accurate to the car, but you could do it if you want to. The race clutch and flywheel, suspension. I have opted for the brake balance controller. I'm not personally using it, so you don't have to do that, but I know that some people do prefer to use a foot brake style of corner entry for drifting rather than a handbrake. And as a quick tip for those who don't know what I'm talking about, again for those who are maybe less of a drifter, basically if you put your bias on the brakes more to the back end, you can lock up the rear wheels. So it kind of acts almost like a handbrake. The reason why I personally don't like that quite as much is because it means your corner entry can't be quite as ballistic, because you have to use the brakes to slow down as well as to lock up the wheels at the end of the day. So it's up to you. I personally have it fitted just to remind me to say that, basically. But for me, that's not really my driving style. I prefer to throw it in and use the throttle, or just use the weight balance to drift, and or the handbrake. As far as the rest, though, the racing tyres aren't necessary. For the extreme stuff, of course, we're actually finally using the hydraulic handbrake and the steering angle adapter for an actual drift car for a change. And then for the ultimate section, nothing is fitted there. You could go for the carbon prop. I haven't on this particular car. It does lower the points a little bit, and I just don't really recall the car being able to have that or not in the older games. Maybe it could. If you could fit the carbon prop shaft to the BP Falcon in the older games, it would indicate that it doesn't have one. So that would also support my argument of not fitting it, but I don't remember if that's the case or not. As far as the visuals, of course, I'll have put a link in the description as always to grab this player's livery. Quite a few people have unsurprisingly done this one, but I really like the representation that this player has done. Now, as far as the actual build, we've got sports hards on the front, comfort hards on the rear. This is going to be potentially a point of contention for drifters who are seasoned because everyone has their own choice of tyre. Some people like to have a wildly different, racing versus comfort, sports versus comfort, and vice versa. Some might prefer sports, or some might prefer softs, I should say. Some might prefer hards. Some may go for mediums. There's just so much choice and so much of a mismatch that you can go for. That's just what I've gone for. So give it a try, and if you want to change it, of course you can. As far as the suspension, 105mm front and rear, so it's slammed to the ground, in other words. Full anti-roll, so there's no body roll pretty much whatsoever. As far as the dampers, those are actually as low as they can go. So they're super soft, in other words, but then the springs are not quite maxed out, but they're very high. So it's the springs doing all of the work. As far as the camber, of course, we're not going for stability here. It's a drift build, so you want it to be pretty mismatched. I've gone for 4 degrees on the front, so pretty hefty. 1 degree on the rear. Again, everyone has their own preference for drifting when it comes to camber, though. I've gone for a huge amount of toe on the front, so it's towed wildly out, all the way up to 1. And then for the rear, it's towed out just a little bit. And the reason why it's only a little bit is because, obviously, being a rear-wheel drive drift car anyway, it's not like a front-wheel drive where you have to really work to get that back end to come out. It's going to come out anyway. So that's just a little bit of toe out just to get it going into the corner. Again, for my personal driving style, that suits me down to a T, just kicking the tail out with the throttle. As far as the diff, 10, 30 and 20. That will definitely not be to every drifter's taste, because that's a fairly standard kind of entry-level diff setup, more like a circuit build. So again, try it and see what you think. You might be surprised. As far as the transmission, pretty close ratios, 250 kilometers an hour, which is like 150, 160 miles an hour. I guess if you're on a bigger track, you might want to extend that, but I'm going to take it out to Tsukuba. You don't really need that much performance, especially when you're spinning up the wheels all the time. As far as the ballast, I've added 154 kgs, which brings us up to the Gran Turismo 6 weight. I've put that all the way to the front, so almost a 60-40 split. Like I said, getting that back end to be nice and loose. ECU and restrictor are untouched. For the downforce, I've got those as low as they can go. It does have a little bit more on the rear. Again, this is a point of personal preference, and this is one of the reasons why, to be honest, I don't tend to do too many drift builds, because the majority of my tune tutorials are designed to help people who don't know very much about tuning to have a leg up and have more of an advantage or more of a chance of winning or competing or whatever. Either that or just a car that's fun to drive, in other words. For drift builds, there are so many different preferences that people have that there is no one size fits all. So this will categorically not work for every style of drifter, which is why I keep saying you can change this, you can change that. I'm sure it's annoying to hear, but I do have to stress that because there's so much variation involved. Now, all of these over here you can see that we've already fitted, and naturally all that remains is to actually jump out to the track and show you what it can do in practice. So if you're not a great drifter, in terms of maybe you can do it but you don't do it that often, if you maybe would like to be better or you want to get more practice, you don't really have a car maybe to do that with, I would recommend trying this, because A, the RX-7 is not very expensive. This doesn't have like a motor swap or anything like that, so it's not too expensive to build either. And if you give a try to what I've done, I think that will give you a gauge of, first of all, whether or not this is something you want to pursue more in terms of getting better at it and enjoying it, but also secondly, it might be a good marker of what kind of drifter you are. Because I said some people like to throw the car in and just use the weight distribution to initiate the drift. Some people like to essentially do the same thing but rely more on the throttle. And then some people like to lock up the brakes or initiate the handbrake. Of course, if you do enjoy it, I will do more drift builds in future, and of course check out the rest of the special projects builds this week and the ones which I've already done. But for now, thanks for watching.